For 8 months, Sergeant David Martinez had carried one burning hope through the scorching heat of Afghanistan, the moment he would return home to his 8-year-old daughter Luna. During sleepless nights in the barracks, he would close his eyes and picture her radiant smile. Imagine her running into his arms. Feel the warmth of her embrace that would wash away all the darkness of war. But when he finally stood outside the window of what should have been a loving home, peering through glass stained with neglect, the scene that unfolded before him would shatter every dream he had cherished. This was not the reunion he had imagined. This was the beginning of a father's desperate fight for justice. The acrid smell of industrial cleaner burned Luna's throat as she knelt on the cold linoleum floor, her small hands gripping a worn cloth that was far too large for her delicate fingers. At 8 years old, she moved with the careful precision of someone 3 times her age, ensuring every inch of the kitchen floor was spotless. Each movement was calculated, silent, designed to remain unnoticed in a house where visibility meant punishment. Her knees were red and sore from the rough surface, but she had learned not to complain. Her Aunt Victoria sat rigidly at the wooden table, nursing a cup of bitter coffee, while her eyes tracked Luna's every movement with the intensity of a predator watching prey. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the methodical scraping of cloth against tile and the occasional sound of Victoria's disapproving sighs. "Move faster, you little burden." Victoria's voice sliced through the quiet like a razor. "I don't have time to watch you crawl around like some wounded animal." Luna's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up. She had learned long ago that eye contact only made things worse. Her tiny hands worked with renewed urgency as fear wrapped around her chest like barbed wire. After finishing the floor, her next task was washing the breakfast dishes. She had to drag a wooden stool to reach the sink, her feet barely touching the ground even with the boost. The water was ice cold. Victoria refused to heat it for wasteful children, but Luna had grown accustomed to the numbness in her fingers. As Luna carefully lifted an old ceramic plate, her small, wet hands lost their grip for just an instant. The plate slipped, struck the edge of the sink with a sharp crack, and split cleanly in two. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Luna's blood turned to ice. Her eyes widened in terror as she stared at the broken pieces, knowing what was coming next. Victoria rose from her chair with deliberate slowness, her footsteps heavy with menace as she approached the sink. She surveyed the damage before fixing her gaze on Luna's terrified face. "What have you done, you clumsy little parasite?" Victoria's hand shot out like a striking snake, grabbing Luna's thin arm with brutal force. Her fingernails dug into the child's skin. "Do you have any idea how much things cost? Your father sends money for your care, but not so you can destroy my property." Tears welled in Luna's eyes, but she fought them back. Crying only made the punishment worse. "I'm sorry, Aunt Victoria. It slipped from my hands." "It slipped," Victoria mocked, mimicking Luna's trembling voice. "You always have an excuse. Clean up every piece, and tonight you'll go to bed without dinner. Maybe hunger will teach you to be more careful." She released Luna's arm with a violent shove that sent the child stumbling backward. With trembling hands, Luna collected the broken pieces, feeling a sharp cut on her finger. A small drop of blood appeared, bright red against the white ceramic. She watched it for a moment before pressing her finger tightly to stop the bleeding. She didn't complain. She never complained. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she carefully placed each shard in her palm, knowing that missing even the smallest piece would bring more punishment. When Victoria finally left the kitchen with a warning about learning lessons, Luna allowed herself one quiet sob before retreating to her makeshift room. Later, when the house fell silent and Victoria left for the store with her own children Marcus and Sophia, Luna retreated to her room. It wasn't really a room, just a small storage space at the back of the house with a narrow bed and a single high window that let in only a thin strip of dusty light. Beneath her thin pillow, she kept her only treasure. With great care, she pulled out a faded photograph. In it, a young man in military uniform smiled with the desert sun behind him. Her father, David. The edges of the photo were soft and worn from constant handling. She sat on the bed and brought the photo close to her face, touching her father's smiling cheek with her fingertip. "Hello, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Today I broke a plate. Aunt Victoria got very angry, but I'm okay. I wish you were here." She closed her eyes, trying to remember the sound of his laughter, the feeling of his big warm hands lifting her into the air. Those memories were a balm for her wounded soul, a small fire she kept alive in the darkness of her loneliness. The photo was her shield, her proof that somewhere in the world someone loved her. It was the only reason she endured each day. Next door, Mrs. Elena watered her vibrant bougainvillea. She was a 70-year-old woman with a back bent by time, but with eyes that missed nothing. From her kitchen window overlooking Victoria's yard, she had been a silent witness to many things. She had seen little Luna always alone, always working. She had seen her sweeping the yard under the scorching sun while her cousins played. She had seen her wearing old, worn clothes that were either too big or too small. And more than once, she had noticed how the child flinched whenever her aunt approached. The bruises that occasionally appeared on Luna's arms never seemed to match the innocent explanations Victoria provided to neighbors. That afternoon, she watched Luna come out to the backyard to take out the trash. She saw her small figure move like a shadow, shoulders drooping. She saw the red stain on her finger and how she hid it. The old woman's heart ached. She knew about abuse, not from reading about it, but from having lived it and witnessed it throughout her life. As she watched the child disappear back into the house, Mrs. Elena sighed, and a melancholy thought formed in her mind, a truth polished by decades of observing human nature. Sometimes, she thought to herself as the water from her sprinkler darkened the dry earth, the deepest scars are invisible, and the most painful cry is the one drowned in silence. She didn't know what she could do, but she felt in her old bones that this child's silent sadness was a storm that would eventually break, and she prayed that when it happened, there would be someone there to protect her. Hundreds of miles away, in a dusty military base, Sergeant David Martinez was packing his gear with mechanical precision while his mind wandered to a small town where his daughter waited. His best friend and fellow soldier, Carlos, sat on the adjacent bunk cleaning his rifle. "You've got that distant look again," Carlos observed without glancing up. "Thinking about Luna?" David sighed deeply. "Always, Carlos, always." He pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph of a smiling little girl with bright eyes and pigtails. "I received a package from Victoria 2 days ago. It was supposed to be from Luna. That should have made you happy." "It wasn't from her." David's voice carried a hollow quality. Inside was a drawing, crude flowers in garish colors. It wasn't her style. Luna draws with detail, with heart, and there was a typed note from Victoria saying Luna was too busy playing to write to me herself. David shook his head slowly. "My daughter is never too busy for me. She knows how to write my name. She always puts it on her drawings." Carlos stopped cleaning his rifle and looked directly at his friend. "Maybe you're overthinking this." "I don't know," David admitted, "but for weeks I've had this feeling, this strange sensation in my chest that won't let me sleep. Something isn't right. It's like those instincts you get on the battlefield just before everything goes wrong." He stared at the photograph, the paper worn thin from handling and stained with drops of sweat from countless nights when worry kept him awake. The little girl's smile seemed like a silent plea for help, and somewhere deep in his soldier's instincts, he knew his daughter needed him more than ever. In that moment, David made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to see her." Carlos stood up sharply. "What?" "Just like that." "Just like that," David confirmed. "I'm requesting emergency leave. I'll say it's her birthday, or a family emergency. I don't care what I have to claim. I feel like I need to go now." "It's a long journey, David." "I know, but I can't ignore this feeling. I'd rather be wrong and find her happy and safe than stay here and discover later that I was too late." An hour later, with a backpack over his shoulder and emergency leave approved in his pocket, David was boarding a bus that would take him on the first leg of his long journey home. As the vehicle started moving, raising a cloud of dust, he settled into his seat and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about abuse, or his sister-in-law, or his strange suspicions. He was only thinking about his daughter's face when she opened the door and saw him there. He was thinking about her scream of joy, her little arms around his neck, the smell of her hair. It was going to be the best surprise in the world. He smiled to himself, unaware of the storm awaiting him, traveling with a heart full of pure and luminous hope that would soon be shattered. The bus rumbled through the night, carrying a father toward a truth more devastating than any battlefield he had ever faced. The journey was exhausting. Nearly 24 hours of buses, transfers, and anxiety. But when David finally arrived at the familiar streets of his hometown, when he saw Victoria's house with its cheerful yellow facade and red geraniums in the windows, a part of him hoped his fears had been unfounded. He approached the front door, ready to ring the bell and surprise his daughter, but something made him pause. The idea of the surprise, the one he had rehearsed in his mind throughout the entire journey, suddenly felt important. He wanted to steal a glimpse of Luna's happiness before revealing himself. He wanted to see her in her world, playing and laughing, unaware of his arrival. It was a decision born of pure love, and it was the decision that revealed the horrifying truth. Instead of knocking, he quietly walked around to the side of the house, following a narrow cement pathway that led to the backyard. From there, he could see the kitchen door and window. The curtain was partially drawn, allowing a partial view inside. His heart raced with anticipation. He was just meters away from seeing his beloved daughter. Crouching low with an enormous smile on his face, David prepared for the moment he had dreamed about for months. With the careful movements of a soldier on reconnaissance, he approached the window, ready to witness the happy family scene he had traveled hundreds of miles to see. David peered through the edge of the kitchen window, his mind prepared for an explosion of joy at seeing his daughter playing, or perhaps helping Victoria prepare a snack. The first thing he saw was Victoria's back as she stood by the stove. His heart leaped with anticipation as he searched for Luna, expecting to see her sitting at the table drawing. But the table was empty. The floor was empty too. Confused, he shifted to get a better angle. Then he saw her. His world stopped. Luna wasn't playing. She wasn't drawing. She was on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen, curled up in a ball so small she looked like an abandoned doll. His smile vanished, replaced by bewilderment. His soldier's eyes, trained to notice every detail, began registering the scene with horrible clarity. He noticed his daughter's shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He noticed the object in front of her on the floor, a metal bowl, old and dented, a dog bowl that had belonged to Victoria's old pet, a Labrador that had died the year before. For a second, his brain refused to process the information. It made no sense. It was a surreal image, a waking nightmare. Then he heard Victoria's voice. And it wasn't the sweet, warm voice he had heard over the phone. It was an unrecognizable voice, sharp as broken glass, loaded with glacial poison. "Eat, you worthless creature," Victoria hissed without even turning to look at the child. "I told you to finish it all. That's all you deserve for talking back to your cousin. Now swallow it all or you'll stay locked in your room until tomorrow." David's mind went blank. Victoria's words were like hammer blows that shattered the reality he knew. The air became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. He watched in slow motion as Luna's small, trembling hand reached toward the metal bowl. He saw her thin, dirty little fingers pick up one of the brown, dry pellets. He saw her bring the dog food to her mouth while silent tears traced paths down her dusty cheeks. Dog food. His daughter was eating dog food. David's universe fractured. The buzzing of flies, distant barking, the smell of wet earth, everything disappeared. His hearing faded, replaced by a sharp, deafening ringing. His vision narrowed to a dark tunnel with that unbearable image burning at the center. His little Luna, his princess, his treasure, being treated worse than an animal. The innocence he had fought to protect halfway around the world was being destroyed in the very place where it should have been safest. The first wave wasn't anger. It was pain so deep and absolute that it stole his breath and brought him to his knees. A choked sob, a guttural, broken sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a soul tearing apart, the primitive lament of a father witnessing the desecration of what he loved most in the world. The love, hope, and joy that had driven him on his long journey turned to ashes in an instant, and from those ashes was born fury, a white, pure, volcanic fury. His soldier's discipline evaporated, replaced by the primal instinct of a protector. His blood boiled, his muscles tensed like steel cables. Sadness became an explosive force. He didn't think. He acted. He stepped back 2 paces from the window, his body moving with lethal grace. He didn't look for the door handle. He didn't shout Victoria's name. He channeled all his pain, all his rage, all his betrayed trust into one devastating movement. He lunged forward and crashed his military boot against the center of the kitchen door. The crash of splintering wood was like an explosion. The door flew off its hinges as if struck by a battering ram, sailing into the kitchen and crashing against the opposite wall. The door frame was left in pieces. In the destroyed threshold, silhouetted against the afternoon sunlight, David appeared like a specter of vengeance. His face was a mask of fury and pain, so immense it was terrifying to behold. His eyes, normally warm and kind, now burned like glowing coals. Victoria spun around with a strangled cry. The color drained from her face, replaced by absolute mortal panic at seeing the figure of her brother-in-law, whom she believed to be hundreds of miles away, standing amid the destruction. Luna on the floor looked up, startled by the crash. Her tearful eyes opened wide. Through her veil of tears, she saw the imposing figure in the doorway. Confusion, fear, and disbelief fought on her small face. "Daddy?" she whispered, the word barely a breath of air, an incredulous question in the middle of hell. The echo of the shattered door and Luna's incredulous whisper seemed to float in the dense, charged air of the kitchen for an eternity. Time froze in that tableau of confrontation. The father as an avenging angel, the aunt paralyzed by terror, and the child on the floor at the epicenter of the earthquake. It was Victoria who broke the silence. Panic, raw and animal, took hold of her, driving her to weave a web of desperate lies. "David, brother, for God's sake, it's not what it looks like," she shrieked, her voice high and trembling. She took a hesitant step toward him with hands raised as if trying to calm a wild beast. "I swear to you, it's a game, a silly game she plays. I found her playing with the dog food and I was scolding her. That's all. She was just playing, I tell you." The lies poured from her mouth, clumsy and transparent, crashing against David's wall of silence. He didn't look at her. For him, at that moment, his sister-in-law had ceased to exist. She was background noise, insignificant interference. His entire universe had been reduced to the small, trembling figure on the floor. With heavy steps that echoed on the linoleum, ignoring Victoria as if she were air, he walked over the remains of the door he had destroyed. He knelt in front of Luna. The furious giant who had torn down the door disappeared. In his place was a father on his knees before his wounded daughter. The fury in his eyes dissolved, replaced by pain as vast as the ocean. He extended his large, calloused hand, and with infinite tenderness, brushed a strand of hair from his daughter's face. With his thumb, he wiped away a tear from her dirty cheek. Luna flinched at his touch, a reflex conditioned by months of cruelty. "Shek," David whispered, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "It's me, my Luna. It's Daddy." He opened his arms. "Come here, my darling. Come to Daddy." That was the invitation that broke the dam. With a sob that seemed to be born from the deepest part of her being, Luna crawled toward him and clung to his neck. And then, for the first time in years, she truly cried. These weren't the silent, frightened tears she was used to. It was heartbreaking, cathartic weeping, a torrent of all the fear, loneliness, and misery she had stored in her small body. David wrapped her in his arms, pressing her against his chest, as if he wanted to fuse her with him, protect her from the entire world with his own body. He rocked her gently from side to side while his daughter's crying shook her body. And then he cried too. The soldier's tears fell freely, silent and burning, mixing with his daughter's, baptizing their reunion in shared pain. "I'm here now," he whispered in her ear over and over like a mantra. "It's over. Daddy's here. No one will ever hurt you again, I promise." After what seemed like a lifetime, he stood up with Luna still clinging to him, her face hidden in his neck. Without a single glance at Victoria, who was now sobbing hysterically in a corner, he turned and walked out of the ruined kitchen. As they stepped into the sunlight, the outside world erupted. The crash had brought neighbors out of their houses. Mrs. Elena stood on her porch with a hand over her heart. Carmen, the neighbor across the street, watched from her door with wide eyes. They saw the scene that confirmed all their whispers and fears. They saw Sergeant David, the pride of the neighborhood, with his face bathed in tears, holding his daughter, who sobbed as if her life depended on it. They saw behind him the shattered door and Victoria's broken, panicked figure. The lie had been shattered. The secret of the house on Sunflower Street was no longer a secret. David stood in the middle of the street, disoriented, with his precious burden in his arms, not knowing where to go. His house was no longer a home. It was Mrs. Elena who moved. She came down the steps of her porch with an agility that belied her years and approached him. Her presence was an island of calm in the midst of chaos. "This way, son," she said with a soft but firm voice. "Come to my house. Here you'll be safe." David looked at her, his eyes full of desperate gratitude. Without saying a word, he followed the old woman, crossed the street, and entered Mrs. Elena's small house, which smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and the peace they so desperately needed. The old woman closed the door behind them, leaving outside the neighborhood murmurs and Victoria's panic-stricken face. She led David to her small living room, indicated he should sit on an old sofa covered with a crocheted blanket, and went to the kitchen. She returned with a glass of water for him and one of warm milk with honey for the child. David continued rocking Luna, who was gradually beginning to calm down. Mrs. Elena sat in front of them in her rocking chair. "True love doesn't need words," said the old woman with her wise and calm voice. "It's shown by offering shelter in the midst of the storm." She looked at Luna with infinite tenderness. "Let the child cry, son. Tears cleanse the soul. You're home now." Epilogue: The dawn of hope. Months passed, transforming autumn into a gentle coastal winter. The thunder of legal justice, which had initially been deafening, faded into background murmur. One day, David received a call from Carlos. The final sentence had been handed down. Victoria and her husband, stripped of their pride and the house they had bought with money stained by tears, faced criminal charges and years of probation that would mark them forever. David listened to the news in silence, standing in his small garden. He didn't feel a wave of triumph or vengeful joy. He only felt a somber, heavy relief, like a soldier who can finally lower his weapon after a battle that went on too long. He hung up the phone, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply the salty air. That chapter of their lives was finally closed. Their punishment was a footnote in the new bright story that he and Luna were just beginning to write. They had moved to a small fishing town, a handful of colorful houses clinging to a bay of calm waters. Their new home was a simple little house, painted bright blue like the midday sky, with a small garden where purple bougainvillea climbed the wall in an explosion of color. It wasn't big, but it was full of light. The healing wasn't a miraculous event, but a slow and patient weaving of everyday moments, of small acts of love that day by day repaired the broken threads of trust. The path ahead would be long. The scars, though invisible, would always be part of their story, like veins in a precious stone. But as David held his daughter, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on his face and the comforting weight of her head on his chest, he knew with absolute certainty that they would no longer walk in darkness. They had each other, and they had all the sunrises in the world ahead of them. And that was more than enough. It was everything. This story reminds us that the deepest darkness can nest in the places we call home, and that silence can be the most heartbreaking cry. But it also shows us that paternal love has two faces: the just fury necessary to tear down doors and demolish prisons built of lies and cruelty, and the constructive force of infinite patience to untangle nightmares, tenderness to teach that hands can also create, and not just hurt, and dedication to relearn to look at the sun alongside a soul that had grown accustomed to shadows. What would you do if your gut told you something was wrong with your child? David's story proves that a father's instincts are never wrong. Sometimes the smallest signs are the loudest cries for help. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe to Soldier Dad Stories for more incredible tales of fathers protecting their children. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to trust your instincts to save someone you love? Your story might help another parent, because every child deserves a hero in their corner.